the second Sunday of Lent. The gospel reading comes from Matthew chapter 17, very, very popular reading. It's the Transfiguration, one of only two times where we hear the voice of the Father speak to Jesus. The other was earlier in the liturgical year when we experienced the baptism of Jesus in Matthew chapter 3. One of the keys to understanding the Gospels, one of the keys to reading and getting the most out of the Gospels, is understanding that the life of Jesus is, as Pope Benedict called, a recapitulation of the Old Testament. In other words, what happened in the Old Testament happens again, but in the life of Jesus. And the astute reader will be careful to look for repetition. Those things that happen in the old are happening again. And this is one of those readings where we see a recapitulation, and that is of Moses going up to Mount Sinai and receiving the law and beginning to lead this, tremendous exodus into a new life. And so at the Transfiguration in chapter 17, it says, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain apart. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking to him. And then Peter said to Jesus, Lord, this is the understatement of the century, by the way, it is well that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 booths here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Now, if you don't know the Old Testament and you don't know about Moses and the first Exodus, this can seem a little bit strange. Why would Peter suggest that they build 3 booths? Years ago, before I really understood the Old Testament, I thought, well, he's kind of talking about a memorial. This is really great that we're here with Moses and Elijah. Jesus is transfigured, and Peter, James, and John are here. This is great. We need something to commemorate this event. Not that at all. What we're finding here is that Peter wants to build 3 booths. 3 booths harken back to the Old Testament when the children of Israel came out of Exodus. We know that Moses went up on Mount Sinai as part of the Exodus, and he shone with the glory of God, and all he saw was the backside of God. But the glory of God, the Shekinah glory of God, the presence of God remained on Moses. And here we see Jesus going up on a mount, and he is transfigured. And we got the 3 booths. When Israel came out of bondage, they celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles. And every year after that, they would celebrate the feast. And to celebrate it, they would build small booths called sukkahs, or Sukkot as a holiday. And that would commemorate their journey in the wilderness out of Egypt, out of bondage. And so Peter is catching on that this transfiguration is commemorating the first exodus from Egypt. Now, in the second exodus that we're talking about here at the Transfiguration, we're talking about a different freedom, a different exodus. But how do we know that Jesus is talking about an exodus up on the Mount of Transfiguration? Well, if we read the Gospel of Luke chapter 9, we actually get the content of their discussion up there on the mountain. Jesus was discussing his exodus, which would begin at Jerusalem. In other words, the Passion. And this exodus would not be from Egypt. It would not be from the Romans. It would not be from the Greeks, but it would be from the bondage of sin.
Now, to be very specific here, it's really crucial to recognize that the new Exodus is both similar to the old and different from the old. So if you think about it this way, both of them are similar in the sense that they involve a journey that has a beginning and an end. And it's a journey that is meant to set the people of God free and bring them home to the promised land, right? However, they're different in their locations and in their destinies. So the old Exodus, think about it, began in Egypt, right? And then ended in Jerusalem, in the sense that the Israelites, the 12 tribes, were set free from slavery to Pharaoh. They journeyed through the wilderness for 40 years, and then they ended up in the promised land, fought the enemies of Israel, the Canaanites, and then finally built the city of Jerusalem and the temple at the time of David. That's kind of like the apex or completion of the Exodus journey. You can see this in Exodus 15, where it talks about how God is going to bring a sanctuary that the people are going to worship him in. So the old Exodus begins in Egypt, ends in Jerusalem. Whereas Jesus' Exodus, this is important, it begins in Jerusalem. And where does it end? Not in the earthly promised land, but in the heavenly promised land.
And I think we can learn a lot from the example of the apostles in today's gospel. It's okay if we feel scared and uncertain before such a demanding and glorious vision. But I do believe that we're called to lean more fully into that vision of a transfigured world. And that requires following Christ down the mountain and learning to change our lifestyles in response to that vision of creation.
Today, the first day of Lent, and for many Christians, it is an opportunity to focus more closely on their relationship with God.
Our next guest is best known for his incredible film and television career, but he's here today as a paid spokesperson for the Hallow app to talk about prayer and faith. Please welcome to the studio, Mark Wahlberg.
So good to see you, man.
So I think it might surprise some people to see you here talking about your faith. We don't see celebrities really talking about their faith that much. Why do you think this is so important to share this?
Well, it's such a big part of my life. I credit all of my personal, professional success, everything good that's happened in my life, I kind of credit to my faith. So that's where it kind of starts for me. That's the foundation. And certainly want to share that people with the routine, the discipline, the work ethic, all of those things are things that I like to share. And I try to encourage people to be the best versions of themselves.
Go back to like my father's heroes. My father's heroes would have been FDR and would have been JFK and Hubert Humphrey and LBJ, right? I can't think of any of those figures as being anti-religious or anti-spiritual. What I've noticed in the West, let's say 30 years, is the left is becoming increasingly hostile to religion. Not even indifferent to it, I mean actively hostile to it. And that worries a lot of us because of the Tocqueville principle. You know, I get it. Religion, like anything else, needs to be criticized. And religious people do and say bad things. I get that. But you can't dismiss religion out of hand as something, you know, primitive and irrational. Think of the new atheist critique from, 20 years ago. But I found it's come into the left as a kind of unsavory element. So talk to me about that, because you just mentioned the importance of the spiritual in a political conversation.
Well, I think it also is important to move people, right? I mean, it's not accidental that King's language is Christian in so many ways. I mean, he says we don't want a thing-oriented society, a people-oriented society. It's not accidental that Gandhi appeals not just to the Bible, but to the Gita and to Hindu faith and to Islamic faith, and because people ultimately aren't just material things. We have higher aspirations, and to touch that, whether it's a sense of patriotism or even higher, a sense of what your obligations are to something beyond just your human existence, is deeply what moves people. So to say that, okay, we're not going to have that conversation impoverishes our ability to have a politics. No, it comes from this fear that, we want to have pluralism in this country. And so I think that the fear was, okay, are we just going to have one faith? But I think America has always, in my view, been a nation of many faiths, and you can celebrate that. And we can create space for that. So, I'll give you a very childhood story. When we were moving into to Amsterdam Avenue in Holland, which was one of the neighborhoods. I was born in Philadelphia. We were moving there. There was a bit of chatter in the street in Bucks County. The Kanas are moving in, and we figured out, what was going on, and that someone said, well, we're on Christmas Eve, we put candles out, and now are we going to have a house that doesn't have the candle lights out? So my parents kind of laughed, and they said, of course we're going to put the candle lights out. We grew up celebrating Christmas doesn't diminish our own faith tradition. And we did that, and we celebrated, and people on the street celebrated Diwali and were curious. And I think that there has, in my view, having a robust engagement with people's faith is a better way than telling people don't have faith in the public square.
Right. And is it possible to have a religious argument in public? And I use that word argument on purpose because I've been saying for years, it looks for a lot of people like there are two options. Either there's just interreligious violence or there's total privatization. Just don't talk about religion. And I would say, no, there's a middle ground, which is robust religious argument that can come out into the public space, not violent, but intellectually engaged. Why couldn't a Hindu and a Christian and a Jew really talk about, and without abandoning their own traditions, but talk out of those traditions and try to find some common ground? This, my second observation there is in the Catholic tradition, we talk about the natural law tradition.
Right.
So you might say underneath, most of the great spiritual traditions is a deep moral sensibility, and that we can find a common ground. Someone like John Courtney Murray in our tradition argued out of that perspective, and that we abandon that at our peril. And then it moves into just a complete either indifferentism or just squabbling in the public square. So, I mean, is there a moral consensus that our country can find, call it the natural law consensus, or some fundamental moral sensibility, or are we stuck with endless squabbling at that level?
So I think there's two things. I mean, obviously there was a sense, in my view, first that that the state would have an ability to define the common good, and liberalism emerged saying, well, we've had all these wars,
Right.
We can't agree on this common good, we can't agree whether it's a Protestant, Catholic, Hindu common good. And so we're going to agree to some basic principles. And those principles are to keep the country safe and have people have individual rights. The challenge is that people still want shared purpose, that's
Right.
that's not enough. Procedural justice, though important, though deeply
Yes.
important, is not enough. And so then the question becomes, how do we build something deeper? Now, to me, one of the greatest articulations of this was Frederick Douglass in Composite Nation, where he speaks in 1869, and he talks about defending the right of Chinese immigrants to come to the United States. And he says, and they say, well, they're not Christian. How are you defending them? And they're not American. And he says, in the free air of America and in the free air of our churches, we will have this, and the best will emerge. And this is going to strengthen not only America, it's going to strengthen the churches to have that kind of dialogue. And to me, that sense that pluralism doesn't mean lowest common denominator.
Yeah.
Pluralism means challenging your ideas, having something thicker, and still having some thicker conception for America that takes from the best of these.
Yeah, and that's the question, that thick description of the moral life. Douglas is so good, isn't he, at so many levels? Still, an
Yes.
important person to go back to. The question of how do you find it? How do you articulate it? How do you find the sense of common good without endless conflict? But that the political should be informed by it. What I militate against is the privatization of religion, which I've seen advancing in my own lifetime. I get wanting to avoid violence, but I don't think it should move in the direction of privatizing it. Christianity cannot be a private religion
Right.
because we're salt of the earth and light for the world, and we're the city on the hill and all that. It doesn't mean you propagate it violently or through aggression, but you do propagate it. I mean, by your witness and by your words, and I would say indeed by your public argument.
Right.
So I'm trying to find that
And do
space.
you feel that people feel judged or censored or not allowed to have that kind of perspective? Going to a town hall, making a religious argument, do you think it's?
I think I think increasingly in our society that's the case, and even the suspicion of Christian symbols, and as you were talking about,
Right.
religious symbols in the public space, because we don't want it to move in that direction of a kind of emptied out. Richard John Newhouse's famous, naked public square is just denuded of any religious or moral point of reference. We can't have that, and I think that's one of the inflection points in our conversation, around religion.
Yeah. And I don't think, when I think back to my parents putting out the candlelights or my tweeting out your piece
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
Christmas, I don't think it's a shallowness, right? I mean, some people say, oh, well, it's just the commercialization of Christmas and now everyone has elf on the shelf and is giving gifts. It's something deeper. It's about trying to respect and share what is holy and important to someone else and trying to celebrate that. And the other person reciprocating that in you. Now, maybe that gets to some common ground. Maybe that strengthens the appreciation for common direction. But if all I'm saying to you, Bishop Aaron, is, well, I respect your right to exist and me not to hit you and me not to steal from you, that's not as
Not
deep a
enough.
bond
Yeah, right.
as if I say, well, I want to celebrate and understand things that matter to you.
Is there a teleology to our political life? I guess is the question. Is it actually going somewhere? Are we heading toward a common good? Or is it more that procedural, element you're talking about? Is it merely protective or directive? That's, I think, in terms of classical political philosophy. Modern political philosophy tends to say the purpose of government is protective, to protect our rights, protect us from, violating each other's rights. But classical political philosophy, Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, Aquinas, would be directive. The purpose of government is to direct us towards some clear sense of the common good. Now, I know that shattered at modernity of the Enlightenment, that consensus around the common good, and we're the inheritors of that moment, it seems to me, that shattered. So we're left with a kind of proceduralism that's good, but not enough, as you're saying. So that's what we, I think, all need to think through in a fresh way. And then we're always haunted by the specter of violence. The minute you're talking about here's the common good, here's the good that we should all be seeking, and someone goes, well, I don't agree with that. And then that's my point about argument. Well, can we find a place to argue about it anyway, publicly, without killing each other or without falling into complete polarization? To my mind, that's the central struggle, maybe, in the political life today.
I completely agree with you, and I think what our nation is trying to do is unprecedented. I mean, there has never been a cohesive, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy on the face of the earth. And so we're trying to do this. And it's not enough to just have procedural justice. We want to have a common good, right? A nation is not, when people say America is just an idea, well, yes, it's an idea in the Constitution, but it's also the Revolutionary War, and it's also the blood spilled in the Civil War, and it's also World War II and the Cold War. It's stories and events, and a nation isn't just ideas. And so we need to have this common sense of a nation, and yet we have all different folks and different faiths and different traditions coming in. Where do you have a common purpose? I mean, at the very least, it should be, in my view, the engagement and respect of each other, and listening and thinking and the humility. But then how do we build this purpose? And in my view, becoming a cohesive multiracial democracy is probably a civilizational achievement for America.
I think of John Paul II there, who said the most fundamental of all the rights is religious liberty, the right to religious freedom, because it touches the very deepest part of every person. So that's one side of it, isn't it? It's like to allow that, say, yes, I'm offering complete religious liberty. But then within that context, religiously free people coming into a shared space and having a real conversation with each other. That's the next step. If we just say, okay, we're all free and I'll let you be, you let me be, then that's not enough for a cohesive society. But now can we enter this common space and really talk to each other? So anyway, I think we're not going to solve that today, but I think that's the issue.
And do you think do you find leaders, without making it partisan, who are on either side, who are able to speak in a spiritual sense to give common direction, purpose to America?
Not nearly enough, no. I would say that I don't see that in the public conversation.
Because King did, right?
King did, absolutely. King did. And look at the top leadership of the civil rights movement was religious. They weren't just part of it. The top leadership was. Is that the case now? I don't know. I don't think so.
God, we take this moment just to give you thanks. We thank you for this time to come together as a family, as friends, and as a country. Help us, Lord, especially this Lent, to grow closer to you. Amen.
Join us in prayer this Lent on Hallow. Stay prayed up.
Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you.
During the second week of Lent, we focus our attention on another aspect of the Joel prophecy. Return to me with your whole heart. It's a reminder to us that God, as he speaks to his people, is speaking at the level of the heart. That the invitation to return to God is an invitation back to love. One tremendously beautiful but also fundamental theme of God's relationship with Israel through the Old Testament is the bridal theme, or sometimes we call it the marriage analogy. Israel often would hear through the prophets the word remember. Remember what the Lord God has done for you, or prophets reminding Israel of all the different ways that God rescued her from the Egyptians, or brought her out into the desert and there fed her, or gave her water from the rock.